Okay. For our very first Lunch and Learn Including Everyone session, I'm really delighted to have Mark Upton from Oxfordshire Association for the Blind join us, along with Margaret Simpson, who's from Oxtalk, but also the Oxfordshire 50+ network, and has a really wide range of experience and expertise of working with people with sight loss and visual impairment. Mark he didn't join Oxfordshire Association for the Blind in April. He took over as Chief Executive at Oxfordshire Association for the Blind in April, but I know that he's actually been with the organisation for some time prior to that, building that relationship with the team. So it's going to be really interesting to hear from him a little bit about his journey and how he's taking things forward now that he's got that leadership role. And as I said, Margaret is chair of Oxtalk, which is a talking newspaper, and I'm just going to pop a link to it in the chat so that people can check it out if they don't already know about it. But we're going to hear a bit more from Margaret in detail about how that works as an inclusive service. So that's a quick introduction to Mark and to Margaret, but they'll introduce themselves and tell us a little bit more and give some insight when we move on to that as well. So the format is that Mark and I are going to have a bit of a Q&A to try and tease out some practical hints and tips and some common barriers that Mark has an awareness of, and some of his ideas for the future and how we can resolve some of those things. And then there'll be an opportunity for people to ask Mark and Margaret any questions that might have arisen from that. And then after that, we'll move on and hear directly from Margaret about Oxtalk before we wrap up, and also hear about the sessions that are coming up after that. Does that sound okay for everybody? Great. Right. Okay, Mark, I'll let you unmute yourself now so that
you.
Thank you. So Mark, do you want to do your own little introduction of yourself? I know I've just given a few words there, but if you just want to.
Yeah, I can do. Thank you. Yeah, I think you summed it up pretty well. Work obviously at Oxfordshire Association for the Blind. I've been here for a number of years now, and been working in the sight loss sector for about 12 years. So I'm visually impaired myself and have grown up with a visual impairment. So I was born with a visual impairment, and it's deteriorated over time since then, but so obviously I have that experience from birth. And I sort of fell into the job when I was younger, with aimlessly having no idea whether I'd even be able to get a job, let alone a career within a sort of charity sector, let alone even thinking about being in any sort of leadership role within any organisation, because you tend to grow up when you have a disability just thinking it's going to be very hard. So hence why I got into the work, really, to help and support and to I guess break down some of those barriers which we face.
Brilliant. So can you tell us a little bit about what Oxfordshire Association for the Blind does and what its core services are?
Yeah, so we're a county charity, obviously reaching anybody in Oxfordshire who has a visual impairment. So although we've got the term blind in our name, which is slightly unhelpful, we actually support anybody that has a visual impairment. They don't have to be certified as visually impaired. And that is in fact around 22,000 people who have some form of sight loss. So that's who we're available to. In reality, we actually support around about 3,000 people across the county in various different ways, and our core work is information and advice and guidance. So really what that means is helping people to adapt their way of living. So when somebody's had a diagnosis at the eye hospital and they've had some support from social services, we then come in to help people adapt their lives. And that doesn't necessarily have to be equipment, doesn't have to be purchasing lots of things. It can actually be just us talking about how we adapt ourselves, techniques, tricks, life hacks, I think they call it now. But those are the kind of things that really can make a difference. And I think that's why it's important, as we're talk about in a minute why lived experience is so important, because we're not just telling people what to do, we're telling people how we do it and how we have overcome some of those barriers. And we might be a little bit further down the line, but actually that's really encouraging for people who are losing their sight, because what they see, what they feel is the end of life and end of all their dreams and aspirations. And we you know, the work we do is to come in and say, no, this is the beginning, and this is what we can do to adapt. So that's kind of our core, and there's lots of work around it. So we do things like social groups and activities. So as I said, meeting other visually impaired people as well is actually really important to help overcome some of your anxieties and barriers, just knowing that you're not alone and you're not the only person facing it. So we do quite a bit around the social, we do a little bit around sports, we do some tennis, we go cycling, we do walks and sailing, different things like that, which is good. Children and young people services as well. So for the youngsters, we have some great activities which are always really fun. So it's quite hard to not go to all of them, but they do great things with different organizations locally, and lots of activities which are great. Yeah, sorry.
I was just going to ask a rookie question in the interests of this being a kind of learning session, but what is the difference between the terminology for visual impairment, sight loss and blind?
Yeah, it's how long have you got? It's quite a big debate, but really I use the term visually impaired because it helps us understand that we're talking about anybody really with sight loss. So sight loss is another term really. Some people prefer to use sight loss just because it's easier to say. People who are generally born with a visual impairment tend not to like sight loss as much, because really their argument is that they haven't lost anything. Also, sight loss tends to verge on the negative side. It's a loss, which it is, but you know, it can be slightly negative language, so it's used, we tend to use them interchangeably. So you might hear me say visually impaired, sight loss, blind, or partially sighted. So we tend to use them a little bit interchangeably, but generally when we do our training, what we say is to ask the person what they prefer to be sort of identified as, because some people really shy away from the term blind, because what we think of as blind is obviously total darkness, which is actually a very small percentage of people who are legally blind, as they call it in America, who are registered blind. In the UK, about 5% actually have no vision at all, so it's really low numbers, and this is where the stereotypes come in on TV and in media of somebody who could see absolutely nothing, and they tune a piano or something. You know, it's those kind of stereotypes which we're having to battle against, because the reality is most people can kind of see something, but actually, you know, which can actually add to different challenges and understanding and perceptions, where people think you're sort of fraudulent because actually you can look at stuff, just might not be very good vision, which can be very confusing.
No, I get that. So you touched on earlier about your own lived experience. So how do you think that the fact that you've experienced some of the things that people accessing your services as an organisation experience helps you in your leadership, and how important do you think that is?
Yeah, I think it's really important in lots of different ways, and I think some of them I might have not discovered yet, and some, you know, I've sort of later down the line. And I think we seem to talk a lot more about lived experience now, whereas 10 years ago it wasn't really something we spoke about as being that important. We sort of felt, oh well, it's good to have people who are visually impaired in the sector, but now we're having to work quite a lot at trying to get more people in. I mean, for starters, I think showing people that you can have a career and work is actually really important, because it's only 1 in 4 blind and partially sighted people of working age who are actually in employment. So really low numbers. So I think that's a really important thing to say. And if in a charity sector, if we're to go to businesses and say, oh, why don't you employ somebody who's visually impaired, and we're not doing it ourselves, then I think you know, it's a bit hypocritical, really. We've got to be the example of how to do it well before we can knock on the doors of other companies and businesses and organizations to say you should be doing it. Yeah. And I also think disability history is quite dark and is quite depressing. So if we look back in history, disabled people have been unfortunately very much marginalized and cut out and shut out from society. Obviously a lot's changing, but what we've found in the charity sector, and which has been really common, and it's been generally focusing on what we would say is non-disabled people, telling disabled people what they should be doing, which actually is a very negative thing, and it shouldn't be that way. We should be led by disabled people, and as a visual impairment organisation, we're really proud to say, our chair of trustees is visually impaired, and myself as chief executive now are visually impaired. Doesn't mean that we're going to be perfect, by no means, but it does mean that we have that understanding, and we're not there just necessarily dictating what we feel should be done, but we do actually have an understanding of that, those challenges and those experiences. And I think what I'd encourage people is to actually look at some of the different models of disability and think about it within your own organisations and how you approach disability as a whole, because charity sector has very much followed the medical view of disability, which is to suggest that the person with a disability has the problem and it needs fixing, whether medically or doing things for people. And the charity sector has done that a lot over the years, whereas what the social model of disability suggests is that actually the problem is society, and that we need to change society and society's outlooks and the barriers that society puts in place so that disabled people can be included. And I think that's where lived experience really fits in well with the social model of disability, to actually create those changes and put those changes forward.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. I like that idea of that shift to a social model of disability and interrogating our practices to see if they fit with that. Yeah,
it's really challenging, because it's sort of changing, unfortunately, fundraising within the charity sector has very much looked at, those poor blind people over there, they really need your money. And what we're suggesting is, that's really unhelpful, because we live lives, we live our lives. We're not all at home crying our eyes out because we can't drive or because we can't do X, Y, and Z. Actually, we want to be promoting how proud we are of our differences. And that's really, really hard, because we're obviously meeting people each day who are losing their vision, and we're turning around going, yeah, actually really proud to be visually impaired. No,
it's I can see that's tricky, but a really interesting thing to talk about and explore. So in the modern world, social media is increasingly this massive vehicle for information and promotion and getting the message out there, and doing that through social media platforms, but also websites. So from that practical angle, what would be your top 3 tips for making websites and social media from organisations more accessible to people with visual impairment?
Yeah, okay. So, it's a really big topic. So I feel like top 3 is a bit of a challenge, but yeah, I understand. I think number 1, I think, would be to include disabled people in whatever you're doing, particularly for websites, is to actually include them in testing. So there's a lot of automation out there, and if you get involved in a website, you can download an automated test, and it will give you X percentage is accessible. But actually, the reality is, it might be accessible on paper, but for example, if you include an image description, the automation would tell you that it's got a description, but it wouldn't actually tell you whether the description is useful or not, or actually includes the content of the photo. So you need to use people to actually engage with your content, and gauge whether it is actually accessible for them. So that's number one, I'd say. Number two, I think is I'd say be open to the change, and actually investigating what you need to do, because it is a minefield and it is a big area, and it can be quite overwhelming. But I think to take that step by step and sort of create a plan, okay, well, we need to change this, we need to change that. It's not necessarily about completely overhauling your website and spending lots of money. It can actually be, just some simple steps, and I think investigating those simple steps by doing it. There's plenty of webinars out there. We've done a few in the past about making things more accessible. So again, just attending those things and making those small implementations. So it's a bit of a broad one, but it's important to get that in our mindset, that change is important, and that it doesn't have to be really costly. And the argument is that they call it the purple pound, which is basically the amount that people with disabilities will spend for businesses, or that can access your organization, is quite high. So if you invest a little bit of money into it, you will actually get a larger return, although that's business talk, but the same goes with charitable sectors and organizations. If you want disability inclusion, then you need to ensure obviously that your front door is open and accessible, your website. And social media, so number three will be a bit broad again, but social media, things like image descriptions on Twitter and Facebook, and including, so what tends to happen, and it's a really easy thing to do on social media, is to post an image of text, because you're limited to characters or limited to the amount you can post. People often will take a screenshot or an image of lots of text, and if there's no link to it, or a description to what's in that image, then somebody who's visually impaired, who uses a screen reader, so it will read the content out, it will literally just say image, and that'll be it. And that it is actually really frustrating, because the amount of content you come across, and it says, yeah, take a look at our fantastic event, downwards pointing arrow, and then it just says image, and you're like, oh, sounds great, I won't be going. So things like that, and if you can't include it all in the image description, is to actually just have a separate link to the content on another website somewhere else, to ensure that people can control that. It's actually a lot better to have a separate link in a sense on top of the image description, because you unfortunately, image descriptions with screen readers is just read out as one long piece of text, so if you can't control it as easily. And within that, I'd say things like hashtags as well. If you're using hashtags, quite comically, you should really capitalize the first letter of every word within your hashtag, because what a screen reader does is it reads it as one long word, which can be kind of totally confusing, and you can get some really odd words within there because it's mashed it all together. So if you just capitalize the first letter, it's a very simple thing to do, and it makes more sense. It's also easier to read visually if you capitalize the letter. They actually call it, I think, camel caps or something like that, because it's like the humps of a camel, which is a good way to remember. Is your hashtags have the capital letter in each for the beginning of each word.
You told me that quite a while ago, I think, just in our kind of general interactions on Twitter, and it was just like a real light bulb moment for me, and I've kind of been really committed to doing it.
Excellent. Thank you.
But, yeah.
Well, I mean, one thing I like to do is to actually thank people on social media who do it, because there are a lot of businesses that don't, but there are also a lot of organizations that do. I mean, it's not that time consuming. You literally just have to type in what you see on the image. I mean, some people go really overboard and they describe literally everything within the image if it's just a photo, and you're there for hours listening to how the birds are in the background and the trees are green and all that stuff. I think I wouldn't say you have to go to that sort of detail unless it's important. Yeah. I always say to people, if you're trying to find a destination, you're not interested in how, it'd be like Google Maps telling you how beautiful the scenery is on the side. I mean, you don't need to know that. you want to know how to get to your destination. So yeah,
I think increasingly, because I know a lot of organisations use Canva to sort of put together images and graphics that they can use, and they do drop text into it. And I think I've definitely fallen foul of it before. I think it is something increasingly, because you turn it into a PDF or whatever at the end, and then it's just that image. I think being mindful of the fact that if you use text in that's important information, that's going to be excluding people unless you...
Exactly. That's exactly it. So if that text is not available anywhere else, then then that's inaccessible, obviously. So having that either within the image description or as another link, I think is really important for people.
Yeah, no, really, really good. Thank you. And I know that's not the definitive answer to everything. And
no. I mean, but it could be a barrier to somebody, and that's, you want to try and avoid those barriers as much as possible.
Yeah, and also obviously, people are getting a chance to kind of see and hear from you today as well, and so it's about kind of going back and asking more questions and seeing how we can kind of build that support and resource.
I have to say, just as a total aside, I think I remember a few years ago thinking, oh, we're never going to recruit volunteers from Twitter. Like, who's going to... Okay, I was totally at my words. We had quite a lot of volunteers recruited for Twitter. So, it is really an angle to go. It's not, it wouldn't be the only angle, but I was pleasantly surprised. So
yeah, things are definitely changing there on that front, aren't they? And I guess sort of be ready to capitalize it and make best use of it. So moving on to volunteers and recruiting volunteers through different routes, what do you think are some of the biggest barriers to volunteering for people with sight loss and visual impairment?
Yeah, I think so a lot of it comes down to knowing whether so if you're visually impaired, is knowing whether you can actually do something, and knowing whether the organisation is open to you joining and then taking that risk. So sometimes it's actually, I find that what will happen is people build up a sort of knowledge of who in the area is a good recruiter for volunteers with a visual impairment, and who is a good supporter, and that comes through sort of word of mouth and respect and trust. So some of it is certainly down the line, but I think things like just knowing whether it's a suitable role for you, and knowing whether the organisation is open to somebody with a visual impairment or just a disability coming along and taking part. And I think that's where in things like your recruitment information, just to having the information out there, and to say, look, we're a supporter of people with disabilities, and we will, make reasonable adjustments if need be for this particular role. And now with, I think it's a case of being open to the change. You might not have the answer to how, as an organisation, you might not have the answer to how to make the adaptations, but what people tend to do is they assume, oh, they won't be able to do that, so we won't accept that them as a volunteer. That, to be honest, that's more common in employment rather than in volunteering, but it still can be a barrier if the organisation or the volunteer coordinator makes an assumption of what that person can or can't do, and then they don't recruit them or don't make it available to somebody who's visually impaired. So I think a lot of it comes down to the attitudes of the organisation and how they present it. And I think people should shout about the fact that they are a recruiter of disabled volunteers, and they are a recruiter of different things, and highlight those facts, because that will build the respect and build just the local knowledge of who you are as a volunteer organisation, and that people do this.
And so, but following on from that, if you're, as an organisation, you want to be committed to being able to offer volunteering opportunities to people with sight loss, would you say that that it is just about having that kind of transparent conversation with somebody, or are there other things for organisations to think about when they want to make sure that their volunteering opportunities are open to people?
Yeah, so like I said, I think it starts with attitude, because everything else can come from that. So, I mean, the fact that people are here today obviously has a good attitude, but sometimes you have to work within your organisation as a whole to sort of change the mindset and the understanding. It starts from that, but you know, things from that will come out. So things like the access of the place you're working at, you know, how accessible is your environment, the working environment of the volunteer. So can they access your environment? And that can be in various different ways. From a visual impairment perspective, it could be the lighting levels. It could be, you know, if where you're located. It could be that you know, there's no step-free access. It could be lots of things like that. The good thing is at the moment, and probably into the future, we're doing a lot more remote working, a lot more remote volunteering. So that adds another sort of avenue for people to be able to volunteer for your organisation. And it's worth obviously again shouting about that and saying, you know, remote volunteering is available and you can do this at home on the phone or via Zoom or Teams or something, you know, and yeah, I think that's, you know, those are sort of the things organisations can look at in terms of accessibility. And then, as we just touched on, you know, are your materials actually accessible, and where you're advertising, you know, are your recruitment packs in an accessible format? Unfortunately, we can't go into all the detail into that today, but you know, there's lots of resources online. There's lots of ways you can check. And again, you know, recruiting disabled people to check your documents. It could be a good place to start. You know, check your recruitment packs and your recruitment information, and then where you advertise. You know, if you're only advertising in, say, the Oxford Mail in print, then you're probably unlikely to get many visually impaired volunteers. But if you're doing different avenues, you know, talking to other groups, you know, getting a wide spread of places you advertise, then you're more likely to pick up you know, sort of volunteers from those sort of different backgrounds. I think radio as well. I think radio is really important to actually talk, you know, go on BBC Oxford. I'm sure they'd love to have most organisations on there, just saying what opportunities you have and sharing that. And for our clients, that's a really big sort of place where they obviously gain information. And from Oxtalk themselves and Margaret and places like that, I'm sure we'll happily put in, you know, things like adverts for volunteering. So
yeah, no,
sorry, I probably went off piece there.
No, you didn't. Brilliant tips there. There's just so much to kind of follow up on and think about. So finally, what are your overall hopes for the voluntary and community sector in Oxfordshire in terms of inclusion, and where could we be this time next year if we really collectively take inclusion seriously? What's your kind of you know, what's your kind of real hopes and aspirations if people do run with this?
Yeah, I think so from a disability perspective, but also broadly, I'd love to see more people with lived experience within the sector. You know, broadly, I think, and in leadership, I think that's really important. And I'm not sure locally in terms of all the different charities who do different things, but for me, it makes sense that, you know, if you're a particular charity focusing on a particular people issue, then you should be having staff and volunteers who have, you know, either been through your services or experienced it. And I think that's probably where I see some of the most important changes will come from, because it's, you know, leadership. It's not just short term, you know, I want to change this and grow it for a few months and then move on to another organisation. It's actually investment. And so that's, if we go back to lived experience here, but that sometimes can have uncomfortable conversations with people who don't have lived experience. But it's not about a sort of takeover in any sense. It's about understanding and supporting each other and having allies within that. You know, I think if we had a visual impairment sector which was just 100% visually impaired people, we would have, you know, we wouldn't get other perspectives from other areas. But the reality is, in the UK, there's only about 7% of employees within the sight loss sector who have a visual impairment, which is ridiculously low. When you look at other charities who have other specialities, and they have more people with lived experience, that is shocking. So things need to change. That so locally, this time next year, I hope organisations are looking more to recruit people within their own network, both voluntary and employment, and we see a really strong sort of show, because this is where it started from, really. If we look back at history, if we look back at some history, a lot of charities start from people who had the experience, and a lot of new charities start in that way. But what I find is it's the long-standing organisations who find it hard to make that shift. So yeah, a little bit challenging for some organisations, I think, but we've been through it, and I think and we're constantly going through it and learning and making our trying to adapt and learn, because as an organisation we have also failed in time and said we should be doing this for visually impaired people, and we've not actually talked to visually impaired people, or we've made decisions based on what we felt, and that's the reality of we're 144 years old as an organisation. So, but times change, and I'm really proud that we are making those moves.
No, that is really interesting. And I think, as you say, sort of longer established organisations have kind of, they've got established patterns of behaviours and recruitment. Yeah. Sometimes it's just that bit harder to unpick. But I think you're right about not shying away from some of the awkward conversations and some of the awkward scrutiny of how we do things, because the potential outcomes are so great that I think you've just got to kind of focus on that and just kind of brace yourself for the awkwardness, because the returns are so good that that we just need to do and collectively support each other to do as well.
Definitely, and it is totally about support. So for me, I mean, if people know me, they know it's not like I've come in here and gone, right, I must be leading your. I mean, I'm very reluctant because of my experience, but I actually see, you see the power of your own experience and how you can then shape your own work, and I think that's really important. And just slight aside, but within organizations, in terms of recruitment, actually recruiting from within is far more successful in the whole of business and organizations. To recruit leaders within and to actually train people up is far more successful than bringing people in from the outside and having to learn and grow. Not to say that isn't successful, but I think it's really important that we grow people within our organisations and within our sectors, and train them up. And that's why I'm really excited. So at OAB, we're getting our first visually impaired apprentice in a couple of months, and I this is hopefully going to be a new thing for us, so we can start growing and developing talent for visually impaired people, and who will either stay in the sector or go elsewhere and develop their skills. So yeah, exciting, I think.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Right, so that we've got a little bit of time for a couple of questions to you before we move on to hear from Margaret talking about Oxtalk. Does anybody have any questions for Mark? Let me just see if anybody's got any. I'll have to scroll through.
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Just going back to the website stuff that you were talking about, I've realised I now got to go and edit my website. But is there any particular colour patterns or things like that we should avoid? I completely understand about the text on an image, as you've been talking, I've gone through my website and realised which ones I need to go and change. But is there any sort of background colours or text colours that we should avoid, or even on social media, how can we make that more accessible, or is it just that technology has a process for that now?
Yeah, so it's not necessarily about which colour, but the important thing is the contrast of the colour. So obviously, you know, and I'm really in favour of keeping people's branding in and not making things look ugly, because it doesn't have to look ugly or horrible, but it's ensuring that you think about the contrast. So, you know, light and dark, if it's a dark text and a light background, and the opposite. And you can actually do contrast ratio checking. So you can have like an add-on for your on your web browser that will check the contrast and whether it's suitable or not. But you do see it sometimes, you know, you see sort of purple text on a red background. I mean, that's quite extreme. I mean, it's totally unreadable for most fully sighted people. So why that gets chosen, I don't know. But you know,
yellow and blue.
yeah. So it makes sense to, you know, contrast it just to make it easier for people in particular. I mean, it depends on your audiences, but you know, I think there are people with visual impairments and difficulties reading with you know, in any group. So I think it's, you know, important that you get that right and check it. But yeah, there are color checkers, so I think that's probably the best route to go down.
I'll have a look for them. So if there's a plugin or something to change it to.
Yeah.
Great stuff.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, has somebody got one? Yeah. I'll take one more and then we'll move on to Margaret, and then we might have a bit of time at the end. But yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm here from Unlimited Oxfordshire, which is a disability charity, user-led, and we kind of represent people on any disability. And one thing that's come up in a recent ring around of our data, of our members list, was the fact that so many people who are disabled have neither access to a computer or access to any digital device whatsoever. So digital poverty, digital exclusion is huge. And I just wonder whether OAB has actually managed to find a way of dealing with that through providing any sort of digital devices for people. And actually, I know you do training of some kinds, and I just wondered if any the physical devices just they don't have and they don't know how to use, or they're very unconfident in them.
Yeah, it's a huge topic, and it is one I'm really passionate about, because I absolutely love technology and the power that assistive technology can bring. We do a very small amount at the moment with, as you said, technology training, and that is really important, because for us, and for, as you know, that for a lot of disabilities, it's not just a case of handing somebody a device and saying, here you go. The issue is actually the knowledge of using it and then adapting it. So, and
also just paying for the actual link.
Yeah.
Because unless you're signed up to a server and everything, you can't get it anyway. So yeah, that's also a cost factor, isn't it?
Yeah. And as you know, generally things around disability aren't cheap. So assistive technology isn't cheap. Devices aren't necessarily cheap. I mean, things are getting better, so we're getting things built in to a lot more devices. Tablets, smartphones are very accessible, but the knowledge of using it, and it's not just a one-off session, which we do multiple sessions of one-to-one of how to use a screen reader or screen magnification. And unfortunately, it's not always so. The other issue when we're talking about online is the actual device may be great, the person using it might be really good at using it, but then they get to a website that's inaccessible, and then they hit a barrier. So, you know, that's a really challenging scenario, because it's some of that, or a lot of that, is out of our control, out of the person's control, and it's having to, society is having to catch up to this fact that their, websites and their content might not be accessible. But one, it's a big area we want to invest more in, and I know a lot of other organisations do, is to ensure that we're training as many people up as possible on devices, and then on the other hand, working with businesses and organisations to ensure they are accessible and they're meeting sort of the standards. So I'd love to do another. I feel like again, we've opened up another topic which I could sit here for hours and talk about, but and in the future, definitely.
Thanks, Mark. I can see that Margaret's got her hand up. So Margaret, if you want to perhaps kind of ask your question or give your comeback, and then move seamlessly on to talking about Oxtalk, that would be brilliant. Is that okay?
Yeah, that is fine. It's just to say that if you were to contact Adrian Sell at OCF, there was a webinar. It was perhaps at the beginning of this year when he brought together a group of people who are clearing out the old equipment, in other words, clearing the information that is there. My old phone, which I no longer use, I'm waiting to hand on, and they will then hand that over to people for free so that they have the equipment, Diane. And
I got several old phones I want to get rid of.
I was just amazed because I have been saying for older people in particular for a long time, they can't afford to buy, and therefore they're being excluded. I had not realized, and I should have done, but I hadn't realized just how much is going to be made available. It's old, but it is usable. And I also understand that even the old modems, I've got one in one of my cupboards here, I didn't realize that they can adapt and use those as well. So it might be just worth going and asking about that, because the equipment is there and it is going to be available, and that's throughout Oxfordshire. I can see Laura nodding her head. I don't know whether you can perhaps remember perhaps individual organisations that were doing it, Laura, because I can't. I was just amazed at how much there is there.
So actually it's part of the wider Community Foundation Get It Oxfordshire Online project, and
Yes.
Sophia and Aspire have received funding to be able to do a big project on this, and I'm actually in a meeting this afternoon with Olwyn at the Community Foundation, who's the project lead. So if anybody wants connecting to that, then let me know, and I can circulate the details and people can get in touch with the Community Foundation. Right, Margaret.
Thank you. Right, Oxtalk. Right, one thing, because I do know Mark reasonably well, one thing Mark didn't mention, he just went through and talked about sport, was to say, I think it's a couple of weeks ago now, and he has recovered, 22 miles he cycled on a tandem, raising money for OAB. He wasn't the only one, but I mean, I just think that is fantastic. I mean, 2 miles on a bicycle would cripple me, never mind 22 miles. So there is an awful lot going on, and therefore Mark and others, because I think there were teams of 3, weren't there?
3 teams of 2, yeah.
Yes, we're included. And I do think that is the important thing, is to actually look at what is your community? Is your organisation actually reflecting the community and who is living in your community? And therefore that, you know, you should be including the services that reflects the people that live in your community. But if I actually move on to Oxtalk, nowhere near as old as OAB. It was started in 1979, so we're just over 42 years old. We are at the moment recording weekly, and the volunteers are doing that from their homes. And usually, and when it was pre-COVID, we would be actually at OAB. We used to share the recording studios of Radio Charwell on the hospital site. And then for various reasons, we had to move because of the hospital needing the particular area that we were in with Radio Charwell. And then OAB offered us their rooms, and we bought the equipment, and we now record, or we did record there on a weekly basis. When the pandemic started, we had to close down because OAB closed down. And so it was a case of getting in touch with the volunteers and asking who's got a smartphone, who's got an iPhone, who feels that they can record individually at home. and then we will collectively send that through to people that we lovingly call the technical officers. And these are the people who bring all the news items together and then download Oxtalk onto the website. There's an MP3 option. We now have the instructions there for Alexa. We use a telephone service so that if people haven't got those facilities, they can at least listen to Oxtalk via the phone. And then, so we did that until last November. And last November, one of our volunteers' daughter moved out from their home, and she said, I've got a spare bedroom. How about if I have the copying equipment? Because what we hadn't been able to do was send out the USBs. And to pick up on what Diane said, and Diane is a volunteer for Oxtalk, and with her husband has been with Oxtalk for a very long time. So we agreed that she would be the only person to use the copying equipment, so that our recipients are mainly elderly, and have over the years been much more used to listening to Oxtalk through the postal service and the USB, which arrives through their letterbox once a week. So by having the copying equipment in her home, we were then able to start the USB service. And we had over 100 listeners. That number has dropped. We used to have 200-300 listeners, but people, because of the internet, a number of people do listen via either their computers or other devices. But we now have 100 people, of which we are able to supply, now on average each week, about 95 people with a USB. So the system is somebody like Diane, who's offered to select the news items for the readers who are not able to make those self-selections for themselves, because they're now working and they haven't got the time to go through the Oxford Mail, Oxford Times to see them. Those news items are selected. We also get information from Oxford Playhouse, and they will tell us when the audio described performances are now, because they're back open, they're going to be available. Over the years, we've had information from the museum services, and we put out when they're having their touch tours or when they're having opportunities that are just for people with a visual impairment. So if you have got events that you're going to be setting up and you would like the people with a visual impairment to know about them, you can just send them to me. You need to give us at least 2 to 3 weeks notice, because the news items are collected this week. They are recorded next Tuesday. They go out Wednesday. So it's a good week to 10 days before somebody actually gets that information that you have sent to me, and then they need to book it. So you do have to think ahead. During this last 18 months, because people are recording individually at home, there have been quite a few changes in the way that Oxtalk is being put together. We had a very good system before, but it's now made me realise that there is a lot of individuality. And so we have people who are musicians, and they have been composing music for us, because obviously we've got to be aware of copyright, or until the beginning of this year. And so they have been composing pieces, they have played them at home, and we've included those. Another volunteer is part of an amateur dramatic group, and they are recording stories. So it gives this extra interest that it's not only just the local news, we are trying to develop the service. And I don't know if you are aware, but copyright changed at the beginning of this year. So we no longer need to have the old stories. We can actually look at for more recent stories. I can send you that link if people, or have you got that link, Laura, for the new legislation for people with visual impairment and what they call print disadvantaged. In other words, if you have perhaps got arthritis in your fingers, you cannot turn the pages over, you are considered to be print disadvantaged, and now there is relaxation on copyright. We still cannot send out Oxtalk to people who are print disadvantaged if they haven't got visual impairment, because the postal service is free only for people who have a visual impairment. And there have been times when people have said, but I can't read the paper, I can't turn it over. And we've had to say, well, sadly, we cannot post a USB to you. Otherwise, we are infringing the postal regulations. And if they stopped us for one person, they would stop us for everybody. So we're not a very large organisation. In total, we had 54 volunteers. During the pandemic, 27 of those volunteers have been able to help. So it's been a very committed group of volunteers that we have had for the last 18 months. And some of them, when Mark says our quarterly newsletter is ready for recording, then they will come forward and they offer to record that as well. We don't make any charge for that, so I'm not opening that service up to everybody, because I think my volunteers would say, whoa, hang on, we don't mind doing it for OAB, but we're not doing it for everybody else.
Mark,
So yes.
we might just have to wrap up in a moment, because I'm
that's fine. I think what we try to cover as much of the news and what is happening in Oxford, so that we can inform our visually impaired listeners. During the pandemic, I did let the City Council know that from our point of view, if people could have access to the internet, then Oxtalk is open to everybody. It is anyway, but it was much more important during the pandemic to actually try and be as inclusive as we possibly could for the people who couldn't get out. And that is the case anyway. Anybody within your organisation can listen to Oxtalk at any time, but you do have to have access to the internet. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Margaret. It's really interesting. And if you do want to forward on the stuff about the legislation, yes, then I can certainly
will do.
Happy to pass that on. And I know a few people have mentioned in the chat that they'd like to know more about the Community Foundation digital scheme. So I'll make sure that all the attendees get the details of
thank you.
the scheme as well. Right, okay, so because we are committed to doing these just over an hour, I am going to wrap up now, but thank you so much to Mark and Margaret for just giving us so much insight and so many practical hints and tips about things. I've definitely learned something and have a few takeaways, and I think that's a really good resource for us to be building. I'll be in touch shortly with the date for July's lunch and learn session, which at the moment we're hoping is going to be all about refugees and asylum seekers, and making sure that organisations can be inclusive and welcoming there, which is quite pertinent after we've just had Refugee Week. So so keep an eye out for the date for that. And if you've got ideas, or you are an organisation yourself that has specialist knowledge, then get in touch, because we really want to commit to developing a fantastic bank that uses the resource and the skill and knowledge of organisations in Oxfordshire to develop these sessions. So if you are from an organisation, or you know someone that you think would make a really good topic for one, then do get in touch with me and make suggestions about that as well. Right, okay, lovely to see you all, and keep in touch and enjoy the rest of your week and afternoon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.